policy statements. And the recording is in progress. I hope you all know this is being recorded, and we will share this recording soon after the webinar or this panel discussion concludes. And we'll share these slides too if you're interested in them. First, let me go through the panel real quick. This is, we have with us today Keith Knop from the University of Georgia. He is heading up the creation of the Music Library Association best practices. We have Melanie Polutta from the United States Library of Congress. She's heading up the policy statement process for LC and PCC. She's also a member of the North American RDA committee, I should add that. And then Thurstan Young from the British Library, and he heads up their British Library policy statements group as well. So all three of these folks have been very active in working with me and James Hennelly, director of, I should introduce myself, James Hennelly, I'm the director of RDA Toolkit, have been very active in working with me and members of the RSC in developing the process for getting policy statements published, and then also working with their colleagues and member communities to create the policy statements that their communities require. So we look forward to hopefully a very interesting discussion today. Oh, where did I go? I just want to go through a quick format of how, or kind of overview of how this will work. We're going to have a brief introduction to the 3R project. I'm just going to go through it real quick, just to kind of set the table for everyone. And then we'll have questions. We have questions from registrants. So when you registered, you were given a link you could go to and submit a question ahead of time, and we have a few of those. We'll have questions from folks here live attending this session. You can ask questions. I'll go over that. And then, of course, panelists are welcome to ask questions of themselves. I wouldn't interfere with that kind of activity. And then I have a few prepared questions myself. You can submit questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom there. You can see the in your menu, you should see kind of two talk boxes together. That's the Q&A feature. I ask that you submit your questions for the panel there because it's a little easier for me to manage. Please don't submit your questions in chat. I encourage you to kind of talk to each other in chat and have side discussions if you like. But anything you want the panel to address, I ask you to add to the Q&A area, and you can do that at any time. I will be monitoring the Q&A section and presenting those questions as they pop up. Okay, and again, as I said, this event will be recorded and shared online. I want to start off with a quick note. Many of you are probably aware that we recently migrated the RDA Toolkit, both the official site and the original site, to new servers on Friday, and we are having some issues mainly related to profile logins. So most of you should be having no problem getting into the toolkit, but you may be experiencing problems accessing your profiles. We are working on that issue, and we hope to have it resolved soon. But I just want you to let you know that we're aware of it and we're working on it. And, you know, if you have any problems besides the profile login, do contact us at rdatoolkit@ala.org and let us know. And hopefully we can get your issues, this big issue resolved very quickly, and any other smaller issues you might notice, or big issues that you discover unrelated to that, addressed as quickly as possible. So, and thank you with your patience on that. Thank you for your patience on that. So the 3R project. The 3R project was a 3-year attempt to restructure the toolkit data and this and we ended up restructuring the standard itself and also a redesign of the RDA Toolkit website. It had several goals that were impactful, particularly on policy statements. One, of course, was the alignment with the IFLA library reference model. It included this reworking included a reorganization of RDA instructions around entities and elements rather than the kind of previous kind of workflow structure to the RDA instructions before. A lot of new elements were added to account for linked data needs, and loads of options were added too. So there are a lot more of kind of declared options in this new RDA toolkit than there were in the original one. Of course, the instructions were also reworded in a different way to better align with RDA goals related to internationalization and machine optimization. So we're really, it's been very important from the very onset of RDA that the standard pursue a path that led to greater international use and exchange of data in terms of bibliographic description, and also that this data was better aligned with current machine needs to perform, to execute on that sharing, etc. So a lot of the instructions have been reworded, kind of rewritten in a way that aligns with those goals. Of course, a lot of new concepts have been introduced, including such things as element, domain, and range, and recording methods, just to name a few. So there's been very significant changes to both RDA standard and RDA toolkit, and it's we all know it's an adjustment for everyone, particularly for policy statement writers. So I'm going to jump in with the first question. That is a question I posed, and I'm going to kind of serve these up to our panelists and have them each answer this question. And I'll try and get them to each answer as many of the questions as appropriate going forward. So the first question is, the 3R project included changes to the standard related both to the LRM and the site redesign. Which changes have been most impactful? Maybe you could each offer one helpful change and one challenging change. And we'll start with Melanie Polutta from Library of Congress.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here and able to answer some of these questions that are on many people's minds. And I have to say that this was actually probably the most challenging question for me to narrow down and answer to, because there have been so many changes that sticking with just one helpful change and one challenging change was itself a challenge. But after thinking about it, I kind of came down to the fact that the site redesign itself and how that impacted the content redesign was in fact both the helpful change and the challenging change. One, I think it's helpful because it does truly organize things based on entities and elements. And I do believe that many people really didn't grasp that fundamental structure in the original RDA toolkit. It took me a while when I was first doing it, and it truly helped me understand the concepts of Ferber that underlay things eventually when I did get that. But many people really didn't get that. And I think that in a sense, this way of organizing things will force people somewhat eventually to think that way, and that will help you understand the concepts much more clearly. But the challenging part of it was, how was that going to impact the documentation? And that's really the whole thing with the policy statements and our whole approach to doing this change in documentation. We had to reorganize things based on that same entity and element structure wherever possible, and then recognize that there were certain things that we couldn't organize that way. and we had to find conceptual groupings of things that we would put together outside of the policy statements and link to the more specific elements where that was appropriate. So that one single change of the site redesign and how it really intertwined with the content redesign was truly the biggest change that was simultaneously helpful and challenging.
Okay, thank you. Thurstan Young from British Library.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here. So in terms of these first couple of questions, I think that the most impactful effect of the changes to RDA from my perspective has been the flexibility which it now allows for application. And this places a greater onus on the authors of policy statements to specify how individual options are applied. The number of options and alternatives in the original toolkit stood at around 300, whereas the number of options in the official RDA toolkit now stands at more than 4,000. So that just gives you an idea of the scale of flexibility, but also in terms of the task in front of policy statement authors. In terms of helpful and challenging changes, I think in terms of helpful changes, one of the foremost is the distinction which the official RDA toolkit now makes between different recording methods. And bibliographic data has always been recorded using a variety of different recording methods, but those distinctions weren't always stated explicitly in the forerunners to the official RDA toolkit. Each recording method offers its own benefits and limitations, and having those flagged at the element level, I think offers users more informed choices about how metadata can be recorded and what functions it serves. In terms of challenges, I think the textual labels assigned to agent relationships in the official RDA toolkit has been one of those. Whilst these labels do offer a granularity, which was absent from the original RDA toolkit, the language used to express them is not necessarily comprehensible to the lay person. So that has been a challenge for us in terms of how we work with those.
All right, thank you, Thurstan. Now, Keith Knop from Music Library Association.
Hello, everyone. I pretty much agree with everything that Melanie and Thurstan just said. For us, in terms of helpful things, if you look at the original instructions in RDA, you might think that music is a homogeneous lump, but it really isn't. There are all kinds of different musical cultures, and I'm not just talking about that in terms of geography or nationality or ethnicity. Each of those things can encompass a multiplicity of musical cultures that all have their own conventions and internal logic. And so the Ferber model in original RDA works great for music that functions basically like books, which is to say mostly Western classical music and traditions that function like Western classical music, so long as you keep things very simple and you don't ask too many questions. But if you don't keep it simple, or you do start asking questions, then the cracks start to show. And while the LRM edits have not entirely smoothed that away, there are some very welcome changes in terms of describing music, and that they do things like explicitly acknowledging the reality that many expressions are based on other expressions rather than stemming directly from a work, which is something that we come across a lot in music. And softening that hard distinction between creators of works and quote unquote mere contributors to expressions, which I think will open the door to more intuitive and useful description of music that does not fit neatly into a book-like model. As far as challenging things, the most obvious one is that a lot of the music-specific instructions, the most complex music-specific instructions from the original RDA, a lot of which really kind of date back to AACR2 or even further back, are no longer part of the base RDA text. And it's still kind of up in the air as to what ultimately happens with those legacy instructions in terms of who's responsible for them, how they'll be maintained and updated. If I had to pick something else, I would point to the aggregate model as something that is both a blessing and a curse, because it clarifies some things that original RDA really left awfully vague, and there are things that we come across a lot in music cataloging. But it's also, it introduces complexities of its own that we're still kind of sanding down the fine details on.
All right, thank you, Keith. So I'm going to move to oops, went too far. Oh, come on, there we go. These are questions that were submitted beforehand by some of our registrants. Again, I'm going to remind everyone they can type in any questions they have at any time to the Q&A area of the Zoom interface. So the first one comes from Linda D. I am wondering if application profiles obviate the need for policy statements. If not, how are they each unique? I'm going to start with Melanie again. I'm going to kind of go through this. Melanie, Thurstan, Keith, if you guys have different views on this, it'll be interesting, but we'll put Melanie in the spotlight first.
Well, the answer here, I think, starts with a conceptual question, because we're really still figuring out application profiles in some ways. And so the answer to the question really depends on how you implement what an application profile is for your group. So for us, what we decided is that the application profile is going to be a very high level, at the level of element instruction on whether or not that element is mandatory if applicable, or not. I mean, is totally optional, meaning you can do it if you want to, but you don't have to. And then the policy statements would then answer a far more detailed question of, okay, I know this element is mandatory or mandatory if applicable, but assuming I've made that decision, how am I going to record it? And so if you take, for example, the element title proper, which is one of the very few truly completely mandatory elements in an application profile, you still are left with the question of, well, with all these options on how to record the title proper, which ones am I supposed to apply, and how, and you know, which ones am I supposed to prefer, and all of that kind of thing. And so the policy statements are going at the level of each of those options and saying, apply this option, or don't apply this option, or apply the option in under these conditions, and so on. So the two things work together. The application profile is not something we're expecting you to consult on a frequent basis, whereas the policy statements, you'll be consulting quite a bit more, and probably the external documentation even more. So they do serve two different purposes.
Okay, Thurstan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think just to add to what Melanie has just said, they do indeed serve different but complementary functions. On the one hand, APs provide the means to specify which elements are recorded in a given workflow, which recording method or methods are used, and also what, if any, cardinality restrictions should be applied. Whilst PSs provide the means to specify whether an individual option belonging to an element is applied, not applied, or only applied under limited circumstances. So there may be a degree of overlap between the two, but the scope and granularity of APs and PSs is not the same.
And Keith?
Yeah, pretty much agree with what's already been said. My mental model of the application profile is something like a cheat sheet or a quick reference chart that gives you that high level overview. Because you could give two people the same application profile, and without any additional guidance from policy statements, they could end up with wildly different descriptions of the same resource. So I think if you're looking for consistency, then you want that added guidance and detailed information about optional, which options to apply, what vocabularies to use, and that you're not going to get from a high level document.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Richard S. Many working catalogers, myself included, think that RDA has become so abstract as to provide little useful guidance in our work. In effect, we have a conceptual model, but no longer a working catalog code for a practical for a particular community. As a colleague points out, we need consistent guidelines to create universally usable data. Can policy statements fill the need for practical guidelines? Should they, or do we need another tool to translate RDA into practice? So we'll go our usual route. Melanie?
I do think that we have to have more on top of RDA text all by itself. Obviously, the policy statements are part of that step. As I was explaining in the previous question, they give you the more specific answer to, okay, this is the option. Am I going to apply it or not? And sometimes it's going to say, I'm going to apply it under these situations. And then I do think with the approach that we've taken at LCPCC is that we're then going to add another level of documentation, which we are calling the metadata guidance documentation, where we're going to give even more detail with lots more examples of how to do it. That's one major change between the policy statements as they exist now with the original RDA toolkit and as they will be existing in the official RDA toolkit, is that we took all the examples out, partly because of display issues and how much space it allowed. So we're putting that into the external documentation, and hopefully over time that may expand as we get more and better examples, as people, really get their teeth into RDA and how it best works. Which, in one sense, this is not really new. If you think about it, even with AACR2, we didn't just have the LCRIs, we also had a whole bunch of other documentation on top of it. So this is really not a new thing.
Thurstan.
Yeah, I think that policy statements in themselves are practical guidelines, but they're insufficient to provide comprehensive policy guidance by themselves. I mean, if we think about the real estate that you've got on the official RDA Toolkit's element page, that right rail area doesn't offer the space that you really need to record detailed policy in a way which is easily navigable to the user. It's optimized for the recording of succinct guidance, which may be complemented by more thorough documentation which is hosted elsewhere. And the official toolkit provides a document editor tool which can be used to generate more comprehensive guidance if it's needed. As with the original RDA toolkit, links can be embedded in policy statements or other toolkit hosted documents, which points to locally hosted documentation elsewhere. So yeah, that kind of informs our thinking as to how policy statements will be complemented by other additional policy documentation, which simply wouldn't fit within the RDA Toolkit element page display.
And Keith?
So in the past, I have compared the new toolkit to a box of unsorted Legos. The policy statements can kind of serve as an instruction manual, but you still need to be coming to them with some kind of mental map to give you the high level structure. And that might be like a knowledge of the MARC format or ISBD description or what have you. But we may not necessarily be able to assume that in the future, new catalogers will be coming to RDA with those sorts of things ingrained in them. And if you don't have that, then I think that high level structure really will need to come from some sort of extra documentation, either an application profile or workflow documentation or something like that.
Thank you all for those answers. And I would like to just interject here that the new toolkit and the 3R project were intended to address the stated goals of internationalization and optimization for the digital environment. And so this is really just a first step. We needed to, the goal here was to kind of create a standard that could be flexible enough to be used internationally, and also to put the data into a structure that would allow us to manipulate it and kind of rework it into different format, different presentations that would be useful, most useful to particular audiences. So this is kind of a step one, and there are other steps to come that will hopefully take that kind of more detailed cataloging information that our panelists have discussed about and make it available in a coherent way on the toolkit, where you can kind of see what's RDA and what's local policy, etc. And hopefully we can put those pieces together in a way that's helpful to catalogers. All right, I'm going to move to the next question. This one's specific to Melanie. It's please discuss the rationale for the LCPCC PS decisions to apply soft deprecated elements, such as parallel title proper instead of the RDA recommended title proper, note on statement of responsibility instead of note on manifestation, etc. Did the PS team engage with RSC when making decisions or advocate for making the more specific elements permanent? Do we know the likelihood of the soft deprecated element being fully deprecated in the future?
Well, this actually goes back to a commitment first made by the RSC and then later made by LCPCC. When the RSC made this transition, they did commit to keeping these soft deprecated elements in order to make the transition easier, not getting completely rid of these elements, even as they did move toward soft deprecating them, as you know. In a similar way, LCPCC, when we put forward the project to write all the policy statements and other external documentation that we were recommending, we made a commitment to do our best to rewrite them, but still replicate current cataloging practice as much as was possible. Now, there are some places where it's not completely possible, and we did have some task forces, for example, that address specific issues, and those will be coming clear as we start doing the training related to that. But overall, our goal has been to maintain current cataloging practice. And as part of that, we are continuing to use many of these soft deprecated elements. As time goes by and we start actually implementing things, then this is going to be a place where I will hope that PCC and or LC members make recommendations to make the switch of going from that parallel title proper element to the option on the title proper element that achieves the same goal. So it's not really a permanent decision of doing this. It's more a matter of first, let's get into this new official toolkit, and then we can start making some of these subtler changes.
Okay, thank you. And the other panelists are always welcome to jump in on a question if they want to. I have some questions from the live audience, which I'm going to turn to now. Leslie asks, with the flexibility that RDA provides, and then every library developing their own APs and PSs, doesn't this make sharing data a bigger challenge? It seems every library has to assess every detail of every record now, or they have a catalog with a variety of implementations of RDA. I know we had this situation before with changes from AACR to AACR2, but it seems it's more of a cataloging free-for-all now. I'll start with Melanie.
I would agree overall that it opens up the door to that kind of free-for-all, but countering that, I think, is the general tendency in libraries to cooperate with each other. So I do believe that over time, we will come to a more agreed upon standard of how we're going to actually implement these options. LCPCC is a prime grouping that already is trying to move together on this. We're not trying to do different things. We're trying to do a consistent thing. And I do know that many libraries follow what LCPCC does, even if they themselves are not PCC libraries. So I hope that given time, that there will become a more settled approach amongst North American libraries. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that libraries outside of the US or North America will agree with us completely. So there will be always some difference in practice, but that honestly has always been true.
Thanks. Thurstan, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I just echo what Melanie has just said, and also note that a similar approach is being taken in the UK in terms of the British Library in collaboration with other legal deposit libraries here, and also we are in regular contact with Library of Congress and keeping a watching brief in terms of what is going on with Library of Congress and PCC. I think the other thing to bear in mind is the default nature of implementations at present. Many of those are still going to be in a Mark 21 environment. And as a result of that, that places certain constraints on how various aspects of RDA are implemented, not least the recording method chosen for individual elements, for example. So I think we also need to bear that in mind in terms of when we think about, you know, the huge flexibility within the official RDA toolkit. We also need to bear in mind sort of the wider environment in terms of encoding standards and how how RDA will be applied in that context.
Keith, would you like to add anything?
Just an observation that, you know, the music library best practices were never really intended to be standalone in the first place. They're kind of supplemental to LCPCC guidelines, so that's not going to change. So we will certainly be pushing for consistency from that front. And then the other thing is that I'm going to assume that the vast majority of people here are not doing original cataloging for most of the things that they do. They're pulling records from some sort of consortial environment like WorldCat or Sky River or whatever. And those, you know, those consortia also are going to have their own guidelines that are probably not going to stray too far from what the various national libraries are doing. So I think that that's also going to help to keep things from being total chaos.
Okay, I'm going to go back to one of our pre-submitted questions here. This one's about music, so it's going to be directed to Keith. Eric says, I'm fairly new to this RDA environment, and I'm especially interested in all the RDA elements related to publishing music and performing arts, music metadata as linked data using the RDA registry, entities, classes, properties, vocabularies. We will be starting a mapping project come Friday. Are there already any policy statements that I can use as examples? I follow the presentation of Melissa Parent on application profiles. Keith?
Well, in terms of something that can be useful on Friday, unfortunately not. There are some of the Music Library Association best practices available in the new toolkit. It is a relatively small subset. Thanks to the various delays from migration woes, there's quite a backlog of things that are still waiting to be posted and that are not publicly available yet. And we have not really delved too deep into the linked data side of things as of yet. There is an MLA working group that is specifically investigating linked data applications for music. Nothing I can firmly point you to as of yet. You may wish to take a look at the Performed Music Ontology, which is a BibFrame extension project that's not specifically RDA, but it is linked data in music, which may offer some insights as to what's been done as far as performing arts metadata and linked data. There is an MLA application profile that will be released in a couple of months, which does at least give you the IRIs of the relevant RDA elements, but that is still under review.
Okay, Eric also had a question live here for you, Keith. Could you elaborate on the process and time span of creating the MLA BP guidance? Are there international partners involved?
I believe I go into this in more detail in one of the prepared questions that Jamie has. So I will defer to that. As far as international partners, not so far. MLA is the US branch of YAML, the International Association of Music Libraries. And we do occasionally get asked for, comments on music specific things related to NISO or other international standards, but at least so far, it has been mostly focused on aligning with LCPCC policies.
Okay, well, let's go to that prepared question I had. I think this is the one, right? Is this the one, Keith, where you said you kind of go into that?
I believe so.
Yes. So we'll start at this top though. How was your institution group approached? How has your institutional group approached the rewriting of your policy statements? What were the guiding principles and the process for such a large undertaking? So we'll start with Melanie.
Okay, well, as I mentioned in one of the previous answers, our first guiding principle was to replicate current cataloging practice as much as possible within the limits of those things that we had to change. A few of the things that did have to change, for example, is handling fictitious characters. How are you going to do that? Handling relationship elements, handling aggregates, and diachronic works. All of those will have some actual changes in policy, but most everything else is going to be fairly consistent in how we've done it before. Then how we approach the rewriting of the policy statements, we first started with the existing policy statements and we analyzed them paragraph by paragraph. And then sometimes, considering what was in each paragraph, we almost did it sentence by sentence and said, okay, what's in this paragraph needs to be related to this element in the new structure. And so we really went through a whole process of saying, this content right here in this policy statement is related to this element and specifically to this option. And fortunately, because of how the new, the official toolkit does things with URLs, we were able to identify very specifically where it needed to be located. That was the first spreadsheet. And then we transitioned to the next spreadsheet where we then organize things according to the element, the entities and the elements. And I would like to say here that the British Library did some initial work on creating that spreadsheet, and I can't imagine how we could have done all of this without their very foundational work. It was huge, and it was very helpful. And so we then organized things, and we continue to use ongoing versions of this spreadsheet where we organize things by entity and by option, and every single policy statement has a row in that really large spreadsheet. If you are truly interested in this, there were some previous presentations we've done on that that were hosted, I believe, at an OPCO meeting of the PCC, and it's freely available for anybody to look at. But that was how we approached the whole process, with a large group of us doing analysis and then going in and writing all the new policy statements that were needed, because what used to be an instruction was now an option. And we had to tell you, yeah, you need to do that option.
Okay, Thurstan.
Okay, thanks, Melanie. The spreadsheet that Melanie just referred to as something we labeled the policy master. And yeah, that was, once the official RDA toolkit stabilized in its beta form, we had a small team create a spreadsheet from scratch, which basically contained every instance in the new RDA toolkit at the element level where you had an option, and provide a link within that option, the option text, etc., etc. So you have basically the beginnings of a shell to kind of populate before you move that out from local documentation into the toolkit. But in terms of the overall principles behind what we undertook. To some extent, those are similar to what Melanie has just described. We decided what we wanted to focus on was reflecting current cataloguing policies in the first instance, and then build on that approach as part of a later phase of development. We wanted to replicate the approach that we established in the original toolkit for creating succinct directive statements about policy application. And we wanted to do so in a way that took advantage of the ability to create standardized boilerplate phrases, which could be reused in multiple locations as the need arose. Also, we wanted to structure our policy statements in a way which allowed for later expansion to encompass other legal deposit libraries based in the UK. So in terms of the actual process, the process of actually drafting policy statements was undertaken by a team of about 10 cataloguing specialists at the British Library, encompassing print, digital, monographs, serials, music, cartographic, early printed resources, and authority control. And they've been meeting for the past couple of years, roughly once a month, to make incremental progress on the creation of policy statements for the new toolkit. In terms of the population of the toolkit itself, that involved myself and a couple of fellow metadata analysts at the British Library, and that each time consists of 5 separate stages. Firstly, we run an X query against policy files in the RDA Toolkit's content management system to identify locations in which it might be appropriate to provide policy statements. Secondly, based on that X query, we create a spreadsheet in policy statement locations which can be populated locally. Thirdly, an XSLT transformation is used to populate XML export files of policy shells with the policy statements compiled in the spreadsheet. Fourthly, we load the populated policy shells back to the RDA Toolkit's content management system. And fifthly, policy statements are published in the RDA Toolkit as part of the next scheduled release. We undertook this process because of the scale of the job in hand. At the very beginning, we were populating policy statements in the content management system one by one, using manual intervention. And it increasingly became apparent that that was simply untenable for the scale of the job that was in front of us. So a batch process approach was really the best one we could adopt, and we ourselves are very grateful to Library of Congress for having pioneered that method.
It's good to hear about all this collaboration. Keith?
Frankly, there was a lot of flailing at first. One of the major differences between the MLA best practices and what the LC and British Library are doing is that the content standards subcommittee of MLA is all volunteer labor, and we were really sinking our teeth into this in March 2020 when nobody had anything but RDA on their minds. So what I inherited from my predecessor as chair of the content standards subcommittee was a rough map of all of the existing MLA best practices to the elements in what was then the beta RDA toolkit, which was again based on that same spreadsheet developed by the British Library. We did not have a really good sense to start with of what the best practices would look like in the actual use environment. So there was a fair bit of experimentation early on to see what worked and what didn't. In terms of the actual migration of content, I divided the existing best practices text into chunks based on topical similarity, roughly by chapter or half chapter chunks in the original toolkit numbering systems, and then doled those out to committee members to work on mapping that text from the old to new RDA and identifying problem areas that needed revision. One of the larger issues, a lot of the MLA best practices in the original toolkit were written at a very high level, intended to be attached to the base element rather than being more granularly subdivided, which does not work so well in the new toolkit structure. So just like Melanie was talking about, we had to do a lot of parsing text into chunks and assigning it to the correct location rather than trying to cram everything into like the pre-recording element, which was something that we very briefly considered at the beginning and then almost immediately discarded. And then once all of the existing text has now been accounted for, even if it's not publicly visible yet, but the next step is going to be going in, evaluating, filling in gaps where perhaps we did not necessarily need content before, but now thanks to the changes in structure, we kind of do. And I've been doing some of that as I've been preparing documents for review, but there will almost certainly need to be a final pass through before we're ready to declare it fit for public use.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move now to an audience question that came in from Mark. Melanie spoke of examples that provide guidelines beyond the policy statement. Will these always be internal LC documentation, or will they be shared more broadly? Melanie?
Well, this is actually not internal LC documentation. This is LC PCC shared documentation. In fact, I would like to make it clear that LC alone did not write these. We did so in cooperation with several members from the PCC, including a group from the British Library, as well as 5 other universities who are PCC members. So this documentation, which includes all of the examples, is going to be publicly available off of the LC website, yes, but freely available to everyone. So you will be able to see these examples.
Okay. I don't know. I know BL and MLA are also creating documentation, which I assume also will be shared publicly. I don't, if you want to confirm that, Thurstan or Keith.
Just as in terms of the original RDA toolkit, we have workflows in addition to policy statements, which are globally available to other users of the RDA toolkit, and we have linked policy documentation from that. We are, as I indicated earlier in the session, in the process of also creating complementary policy documentation that will be linked to the toolkit or hosted within it. And as such, it should be available for view by the wider community.
And MLA is also working on documentation that will be publicly shared. It's kind of an open question where the final resting place of that will be, but it will certainly be accessible through the cataloging and metadata committee page on the MLA website, where you can currently find the MLA best practices for LC vocabularies and the supplemental documentation for the existing original RDA toolkit best practices.
Okay, thank you. Adam asks if Melanie would be able to show an example of what the MGDs look like. Is that possible, Melanie?
Let me see if I could bring up one that is close to being done. Please understand that these are very much still in process. We are trying to get them ready very soon for actual publication, but it is taking a while. So here we have, hold a second, let me share my screen over here. Here we have one example, oops, let me get that out of the way. One example of a policy excuse me, an MGD related to data manufacture. You can see that we have instructions. In this case, we have some specific LC practice, which this follows the policy statement practice in the original RDA Toolkit policy statements, followed by examples in MARC, and followed by, when relevant, examples in BibFrame. And some of them are quite long, and many of them, like this one, will be very short, depending on what information is being conveyed. And so we do hope to eventually share these as something that is linked from the relevant policy statement in the RDA Toolkit directly, but that will take time to get those links in.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I feel like we've kind of, excuse me, I'm having a little problem with I think we've kind of talked about how the new toolkit display impacted your thinking about content and usage. So I'll ask if any of you want to just jump in and comment on that any further, but if not, I feel like it's been kind of addressed. I don't know how the panel feels about that.
I would say that basically, yes, we kind of have addressed this question. I would only add that I do think that as we get into actually using the documentation, that I suspect that more changes will take place and some things will expand in the metadata guidance documentation, and some of what's in the policy statements might transition as we figure out where it's most useful to have it. We did our best to make a best guess, but usage is the true test.
I'm gonna jump in here and absolutely agree with your point that usage is the true test. And this is a design approach we took for the display of policy statements that we thought would be really good. And we've learned a lot along the way. We obviously, I'm sure some of you have used the new toolkit, have seen some fairly weird displays in the right rail of policy statements that are kind of batched together. And while we don't have any immediate plans to make changes to that design, it is something that's on our minds, and we want to see, as more people use the toolkit, et cetera, we kind of want to collect data and feedback on how it works well and how it doesn't, and what kind of changes or what kind of rethink it might be needed on that particular display. So I just wanted to add that. Thurstan or Keith, if you have anything else to add to that, feel free to chime in.
I'd just say that in some ways, the new toolkit display kind of has reinforced the thinking that we had using the original toolkit as regards how policy statements should be created. Our policy statements in the original toolkit were always succinct and directed, and that's I think even more necessary in the new toolkit environment, given the space that's available to display them in the context of the element options to which they relate. And we've gone even further now in terms of individual phrases, breaking those down into a start, a middle, an end, and an exception where one is applicable, in terms of the individual pieces of boilerplate that contributes to that. Because again, it goes to reusability and going to the most granular degree possible has been really helpful in terms of that aim of reusability.
I did have a couple of other points I wanted to raise about this. First of all, just to confirm, we have also removed examples from the MLA best practices in the toolkit for the same reasons that Melanie talked about earlier. And we will also be moving those externally. So those aren't going away, they're just moving. But one of the other issues raised by the site redesign was how the MLA best practices were going to interact with LCP/CCPS, because as I mentioned before, those were never really intended to be standalone, but to be supplemental to LCP/CC instructions. In the original toolkit, a lot of the MLA best practices just say follow LCP/CCPS, and sometimes there's some additional commentary or additional examples, and then there's a little button that you click and you jump to the relevant section of LCP/CCPS. But there's not really a way to do that in the new toolkit in the right rail display. So a user would have to scroll all the way up to the top of the page and then change the displayed set of policy statements and then go back to where they were before and then do all of that again in reverse to get back to where they started. Alternately, we could just link to the LCP/CC landing pages in a new window, but one of the bits of feedback we received early on was a request to minimize the amount of fine mouse movement that was required for accessibility reasons. So what we ultimately decided was that in most cases, if we didn't have a lot to say about an element, but had some things that we thought were important, then we would fill in those missing gaps by adding pointers to the relevant LCP/CCPS, so that the text would automatically be pulled into the right rail display under the MLA policy statement. And since that is just a pointer rather than like actually copying the text itself, whenever that text is updated by LC, then they won't be getting out of sync. And then reserve linking to landing pages for cases where the policy statement is extremely long, or the page is extremely crowded, where you run into those issues where you kind of get a traffic jam where you have to shuffle everything to be able to see the text you're actually looking at.
Okay, thank you. Has 3R altered your institution's approach to specific cataloging practices? Melanie?
Well, I mentioned several areas where there are going to be some specific policy changes, such as for diachronic works, how we're handling fictitious characters in the name authority cooperative file, and something else, which is going out of my head right now. So there are some specific cataloging practices where there is a fundamental change in the RDA content, which is triggering a fundamental change in how we have to handle things. So yes, there are several of those things that are going to be happening, and they will be included in the training. The other thing I think that is a kind of side effect of all of this change in documentation is, in fact, the establishment of the RDA Communication Board by LCPCC. This is a committee that is now going to offer a formalized way for proposals to come in to change or propose policy statements, which I think is makes the process much more transparent and open, so that people can see what changes are being proposed and how they're being discussed, and if and when they will be implemented. And I think that is actually also a very side effect change of how this whole process has changed the writing of policy statements.
Thurstan?
Yeah, I think not so much at present in terms of our approach. I think primarily because we're going to continue to catalog using Mark 21 in a Aleph ILS at the British Library. And in the short term, we will make increased use of controlled vocabularies and URIs associated with the official RDA toolkit and RDA registry. But 3R certainly influenced our thinking about how we want to catalog in future. So I think there is going to be a lot more scope for developing our approach in future around 3R. But yes, again, it's going to be an incremental process.
Keith, does this affect, I guess, your approach to music cataloging, or maybe you want to talk about approaches at University of Georgia, your specific institution?
I'm not going to speak for UGA. We're kind of in a wait and see sort of holding pattern. But as far as MLA is concerned, I think the biggest potential change for us is a result of the aggregate model in combination with the shift from relationship designators to relationship elements. We deal a lot with aggregates in music. Nearly every album is an aggregate. A lot of scores are aggregates. And in hindsight, the kludge, because it's become apparent that it really is kind of a kludge of using that container of work or container of expression relationship, combined with the lack of any real guidance in original RDA as to what a compilation really was or how it functioned, to get around the prescription against recording primary relationships in original RDA was really kind of unfortunate, in my opinion. And I'm personally really looking forward to just being able to say expression manifested, which is a much more direct way of reflecting what's going on in those sorts of resources. MLA has also had talks with PCC about situations where a creator agent of expression may legitimately be more useful and accurate than a creator agent of work, bibliographically speaking, as a qualifier for certain types of resources, especially for recorded popular music. More details on that will be forthcoming. I don't want to go into too much detail now because all the language is still being hammered out. But I do want to clarify that does not mean a return to the AAC R2 era principal performer exception. So we're not going back to those days, but it does alleviate some of the same issues that have often been lamented since the implementation of original RDA.
Thank you. All right, next. Nope, I went the wrong way. Is there any documentation being developed to supplement policy statements? Again, I think we kind of covered this, that we have, so I'm going to skip that unless someone yells at me that you want to talk about it. What will be your approach to updating policy statements, frequency and nature of updating? Melanie.
At this point, we are definitely going to be sticking to the RDA Toolkit update cycle, partly for technical reasons, because we literally can't get it into the RDA Toolkit except when you do an update. So we are going to stick with that cycle as long as that is workable for us. We haven't really looked into any possibilities of doing updates in an in-between way because we would have to publish that elsewhere for a temporary status. And it really hasn't been an issue up to this point, simply because, hey, we haven't implemented yet. So for this time being, we are totally sticking with that consistent update cycle of the toolkit itself. How are we going about it? Well, two things. One is we have established two methods. One is a form that you can fill out so that if you see a typo, a grammatical error, a link error, that kind of thing, there's a form that's linked from the PCC website that you can fill out, and that will come into, well, it will come into my email among other places, and I will see them and incorporate them into the spreadsheet for the next update. And also, as I mentioned in the last question, the RDA Communication Board is if you have a more substantive change to the content of the policy statements, that is a proposal process you can go through. And if they approve a change, then that also would come to the editors, which is myself amongst others, and we would then incorporate that into the spreadsheet for the next update. When we are doing the updates, we can do it either manually or via a batch process, and we will be kind of making the decision of which to use each update depending on how big an update we have. So for example, if I have 5 small changes to make, that's not a big enough update to go through the whole batch process because it takes actual time to do the batch process preparation. But if I have like over 150 changes, well, I might actually want to do the batch process because that's more efficient. That's an internal process that we've been working out here at LC as we figure out, okay, what's the best way to go about this. There's a group of about 5 of us who have all learned how to manipulate the data markup inside the CMS, and we are trying to make sure that eventually all of us will be able to lead this process on a rotating basis. So that's the plan we currently have.
Okay, Thurstan.
So I think our aspiration is to sync policy statement changes with those made to the official toolkit base files. But due to the number of options in the new toolkit and limited staff resource, we're not at that point yet. But as the official toolkit continues to stabilize, the scale of changes which occur with each release is something we anticipate will reduce, and therefore the challenge of keeping pace with changes to the toolkit should be proportionally smaller as a result. The RDA toolkit is in itself a diachronic resource, and therefore there is always going to be scope for it developing over time, and it will be necessary to keep pace with those changes in the form of user contributed content, such as policy statements. I think that the key is the scale, because the scale will determine the amount of staff resource which is required to put into the maintenance and development of policy statements over time. So that's where we are at present and how we see things going forward.
Okay, Keith.
More or less the same thing. We're hoping to keep pace with the toolkit update cycle. And we do get a list of changes to RDA that we can use to evaluate anything that may need a corresponding edit to the MLA best practices, and of course, if there are changes to LCE or PCC documentation that may require further edits, we can also respond to that as well. There is a suggestion form on the MLA website, and I will post a link to that in the chat. There are suggestion forms for a lot of MLA external documentation, not just for RDA. I would request that nobody get too enthusiastic with that just yet until we have gotten things in a slightly more final draft form. So the next toolkit update, I will be sending things out to various metadata lists or mailing lists that were open for general comment. And I do have a spreadsheet of pending issues that all came in while the toolkit was frozen that still need to be addressed. So we have a lot to work on still, but like Thurstan, we're hoping that once that's squared away, it will be a relatively sedate process, keeping up to date with changes.
Okay, thank you. Oops, what did I do? We've reached our last question. So unless anyone else would like to, in the audience, would like to submit a question, I think we've run through what we have. Here comes a question. I'm writing from Sweden, which is a relatively small country with limited resources. Do you have any suggestions for how small institutions that don't have English as their mother tongue should approach the work? I'm aware that this can be a difficult question to answer with, but just to get a different perspective. It's unfortunate that we don't have our friend Maria-Lisa Sipala from the Finnish National Library on with us, who could share her experiences of writing policy statements for the toolkit in Finnish. But Melanie, if you have any response to that?
I suppose starting with a minor one of first, you need to figure out whether or not you need to translate the RDA toolkit text itself, because it really, the policy statements work off of the content of RDA. So whether or not you are going, how you're going to handle things is really going to be a challenge, depending on whether or not you have to switch languages. So that is part of my thought process, that you really need to figure out whether or not you're going to take that time to translate the original text first before you even address the question of the policy statements.
Okay, Thurstan, do you have any thoughts?
I would also, I would agree with what Melanie has just said, and also note that the RDA toolkit is a toolkit. The number of elements within it now is significantly more than were in the original toolkit, but you don't have to apply them all. In terms of what a minimum description is required by the new toolkit, that the bar is set really low, and therefore a first step may be to think about, you know, an application profile in terms of the actual elements that you want to record, or are equivalent to the elements that you already record. Look at those, focus the creation of policy statements on those, and then build from there. In the first instance, when we at the British Library were developing policy statements, we looked at a minimum manifestation level application profile. We developed policy statements for those, and then we built out from that to other entities. And so perhaps that would be a way of getting the most out of the effort and resource that you put in.
Keith?
That's really out of my area of expertise, but I would also suggest, yeah, just starting small with a really core set of elements. I mean, one of the things that has made this possible for us is just the fact that we are concerned with a much smaller subset of elements than either LC or the British Library. Like the Music Library Association does not have a lot of opinions about like cartographic materials, for example. And if we did, you probably shouldn't trust us. But if you identify the stuff that's most critical and focus on that, and it may be that you don't need something that's necessarily within the toolkit. Maybe it's just like an indexed list of instructions that refer you to the toolkit and lives somewhere else.
All right. Well, we're out of time for today, so I'm going to thank our panelists, Melanie, Polutta, Thurstan Young, and Keith Knop, for their time today and sharing their expertise and experiences with us. I am personally very grateful to them for doing that. And I thank all of you for joining us here today, and I hope you found this a useful and informative webinar. Again, we will post this recording as soon as we can. So thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. And thank you, Ramon, who's been helping me out behind the scenes today. Goodbye.